Fast and Furious sells itself as a story about loyalty and family, but almost every decision the franchise makes proves it doesn't actually believe in either. Which is why every movie feels like it belongs to a different genre. Street racing, heist, superhero fantasy, spy thriller, and none of it is organic. It's survival instinct disguised as creativity. Fact 2. Vin Diesel didn't protect the franchise, he hijacked it. After returning in Fast and Furious 4, Diesel gained producer power and began reshaping the series around his image. Dominic Toretto stopped being a flawed criminal and turned into a mythic figure who can't lose, can't be wrong, and can't be overshadowed. And that's why the franchise slowly killed tension. Because a story where the lead is untouchable isn't a story, it's propaganda. Fact 3. The franchise learned the wrong lesson from Fast 5. Instead of understanding that chemistry and structure made that movie work, the studio concluded that scale alone equals success, and from that point on, physics became optional, logic disposable, and escalation mandatory, not because audiences demanded it, but because escalation is easier than writing. Fact 4. Family became a shield, not a theme. The word is repeated endlessly to shut down criticism and replace character development. It's emotional wallpaper used to cover cracks in storytelling, and the more often characters say it, the less it actually means. Fact 5. Fast and Furious quietly stopped respecting its own audience. The movies assume viewers won't remember previous films, won't care about consequences, and won't question reversals, which is why deaths are undone, villains are recycled, and emotional moments are retroactively neutralized, because commitment would limit future options. Fact 6. The Rock didn't clash with Vin Diesel because of personality, he clashed because of power. Their conflict wasn't about professionalism, it was about who the franchise belongs to. And once Johnson left, the series lost its counterweight, leaving Diesel as the uncontested center, which made the films more rigid, more self-serious, and ironically more ridiculous. Fact 7. The franchise exploits tragedy while pretending to honor it. Paul Walker's death became a permanent branding tool, referenced emotionally, but never allowed to change the franchise's direction, because genuine emotional growth would require slowing down, and slowing down would threaten the release schedule. Fact 8. Fast X wasn't split because the story demanded it. It was split because the budget exploded and returns didn't match expectations, turning the finale into a financial maneuver rather than a narrative one, which is why it ends not on a cliffhanger, but on a pause button. Fact 9. The franchise no longer takes risks, it simulates them. Every crazy moment is carefully designed to look dangerous while being consequence-free. Characters survive everything, stakes reset every movie, and danger exists only as spectacle, not as threat. And the final fact is the most brutal one. Fast and Furious doesn't end because it can't. The franchise is structurally incapable of closure, because endings require honesty, and honesty would force it to admit that the story stopped being about people a long time ago, and became about maintaining momentum at any cost. Which is why the real finale won't be a movie. It will be silence, the moment audiences finally stop reacting. Because a franchise that runs on noise doesn't collapse dramatically. It just fades when the engine finally spins without traction. Fast and Furious looks like a franchise that always knew where it was going. But that's an illusion, because in reality, the series survived by constantly reacting to its own mistakes, not by following a plan. Fact 1. Fast and Furious was never meant to become a franchise at all. The original film was a low-risk street racing project inspired by magazine articles, not the foundation of a cinematic universe, and when it unexpectedly succeeded, Universal had to retroactively invent meaning, which is why the franchise keeps changing tone, genre, and rules, because it was never built with a destination in mind. Fact 2. Vin Diesel didn't skip to Fast to Furious because of scheduling or ego. He skipped it because he didn't believe the sequel should exist at all, and his absence forced the studio to treat Fast and Furious as a flexible brand rather than a character-driven story, permanently shaping how expandable and disposable the universe would become. Fact 3. The franchise learned the wrong lesson from Fast 5. Instead of understanding that chemistry and structure made that film work, the studio concluded that scale alone equals success, which is when racing stopped being the core identity and became decorative nostalgia, and action stopped escalating tension and started erasing geography, with bigger stunts replacing spatial logic and making spectacle impressive, but emotionally empty. Fact 4. Many of the most ridiculous moments in the franchise exist not because of creativity, but because of production chaos. Scripts are rewritten mid-production. Actors have limited availability. Locations change, and instead of slowing down, the studio compensates with escalation, bigger threats, louder set pieces, and weaker logic. Fact 5. Fast and Furious is no longer designed primarily for American audiences. International markets now drive its survival, which is why dialogue became simpler, emotions broader, and action more exaggerated, built to be understood visually without cultural nuance. Fact 6. Dwayne Johnson wasn't added to improve the story. He was added to stabilize internal power dynamics, functioning as a pressure valve that allowed the franchise to expand beyond Vin Diesel's control. And once he left, that balance collapsed. Fact 7. Paul Walker's death permanently altered the franchise, but not by deepening it. Instead, Fast and Furious became emotionally cautious, replacing vulnerability with repetition of the word family, because real emotional risk became too dangerous to engage with. Fact 8. Fast X exists not because the story demanded continuation, but because previous entries underperformed expectations, turning the finale into a financial correction rather than a narrative one, which is why it feels unfinished by design. Fact 9. The franchise no longer moves toward an ending. It moves to justify its own continuation, where every movie exists to validate the next. Deaths are reversible, stakes are temporary, and resolution is avoided because it would stop momentum. Fact 10. Fast and Furious isn't really about family, it's about control. Control of brand, image, escalation, and audience expectation, with family functioning as emotional glue to hold together a structure that would otherwise collapse. Fact 11. The franchise pretends it's global, but it's culturally hollow, jumping between countries not to explore them, but to harvest aesthetics, turning cultures into interchangeable backdrops because real perspective would slow the machine down. Fact 12. Fast and Furious confuses noise with energy. Every film gets louder, faster, bigger, but momentum keeps dropping, because real energy comes from intent, not volume. And that's why the franchise is terrified of silence, filling every gap with jokes, callbacks, or dramatic lines so the audience doesn't notice how little is actually being said. Fact 13. The villains aren't characters. They're functions, designed only to push them forward, not to challenge his worldview, which is why so many are absorbed into the family. Because conflict is temporary, but brand unity is permanent. Fact 14. Intelligence is treated as a flaw. Characters who question, plan, or hesitate are sidelined, while brute certainty is rewarded, reinforcing a worldview where doubt equals weakness. Fact 15. The franchise is terrified of aging. Instead of letting characters evolve, it freezes them in mythic stasis, because acknowledging time would introduce mortality, and mortality would introduce consequences. Fact 16. Nostalgia is used as anesthesia. Old characters return not to resolve arcs, but to trigger recognition, because recognition feels like meaning, even when nothing actually changes. Fact 17. Dom Toretto is no longer a protagonist. He's a gravitational field. Everything bends around him: allies, enemies, physics, and narrative logic. And once a character becomes infrastructure, growth becomes impossible. Fact 18. Fast and Furious doesn't end because it can't. The franchise is structurally incapable of closure, because endings require honesty, and honesty would force it to admit that the story stopped being about people years ago and became about maintaining motion at any cost. And the most brutal truth is that the real finale won't be a movie. It will be silence, the moment attention finally fades, because a system built on noise doesn't collapse dramatically. It just keeps spinning until no one is listening anymore. Fact 19. Fast and Furious stopped being a movie franchise the moment it stopped being allowed to fail. Failure is how stories correct themselves. But Fast and Furious can't afford correction anymore, because every failure threatens the brand, the schedule, the merchandise, the contracts, and the global rollout. So mistakes aren't acknowledged, they're buried under scale. Weak writing is hidden behind explosions. Emotional emptiness is covered with nostalgia. And every time something doesn't work, the answer isn't reflection, it's escalation, because escalation is faster than honesty. The franchise doesn't improve because improvement would require admitting something broke, and this system survives by pretending nothing ever does. Fact 20. Fast and Furious doesn't actually need audiences to love it anymore. It only needs them to keep watching. Passion is optional. Criticism is irrelevant. Confusion is acceptable. All that matters is attention, because attention sustains momentum, and momentum has replaced meaning entirely. At this point, you are not watching Fast and Furious to see what happens next. You are watching to confirm that it's still moving. And that's the most uncomfortable truth of all. The franchise isn't asking whether it deserves to continue. It's betting that no one will ever seriously demand that it stop. Because once a story becomes pure motion, the only real threat isn't a bad movie, it's silence. And Fast and Furious isn't afraid of logic, critics, or ridicule. It's only afraid of the moment when the engine is still running, but no one is listening anymore.